The year was 2015 and the motocross world was ablaze with something that we had never seen before but had always wanted. The best from America was facing the best in Europe on European soil to make it even more unique. And on this episode, this special episode of the MXGP Podcast Show, we are going to recap all that happened in and around the 2015 FIM Motocross World Championship. And if you haven't figured it out already, that is affectionately known as the Ryan Villopoto year. Although it was really the Ryan Villopoto month, which is a section in itself. We'll get into all of that on this episode. But before we go any further, thank you once again to Polisport and Prox or ProX, depending on where you are from, for their continued support of this podcast. The 2008 edition that we did in November, was a smash hit. And 2008 is a fairly anonymous year. 2015 will live on for the next 100 years as perhaps MXGP's shining moment. So very exciting. A lot of pressure. But as we'll get into, I will once again be relying on my co-host from the Paddock Pass podcast and On Track Off Road at this time. I feel like On Track Off Road specifically, also Dirt Bike Rider and other things. It's Adam Wheeler.
Yeah, hi Lewis. It's a bit of a sidetrack at the moment, but just writing columns and articles when I feel like it or when I can. But yeah, on Track Off Road still exists, so that's the important thing. And by the way, I love that intro.
What?
How long did you spend writing it? It was just full of like gravitas and drama. I mean, it's like you're teeing up something epic.
Honestly, I just made that up on the spot.
Oh right, okay.
I didn't even think
about it. I hail to
it.
your literary genius and capabilities.
I was about to say welcome, and then I was like, you know what? Well, let's just do something different. So I just followed my voice. You can probably hear a couple of nervous pauses as I didn't realize where I was going or what I was doing. But no, 2015. I feel like you were deep in On Track Off Road at that point. That was On Track Off Road at its best,
well,
maybe.
First
I don't know.
Are you doing a bit of a disservice to Romain Febvre? He was the world champion that year. I mean, do we still remember 2015 as the Ryan Villopoto year?
Yes, we do. And I think everyone does.
Right.
Because Romain Febvre has had a lot of years ever since.
Yes, but his introduction to MXGP, don't forget, he was a rookie that year. It was pretty emphatic. I mean, to win the championship at your first go on a 450 was, pretty special. But you're right. I mean, I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate here because the way to come into 2015 was unlike anything we'd seen before. And In Front Motor Racing, who were then Ustream, I think they just thanked their lucky stars that Ryan Villopoto had won his last title in 2014. And then was completely over racing, but still had 1 year left on his Kawasaki contract and kind of had to compromise, I guess is the word, to avoid sort of paying kind of exit fees or whatever else. And then all of a sudden, MXGP had arguably the most well-known motocross athlete in the world at that time going against a peerless kind of champion on this side of the water in Tony Cairoli. So it all built up to be this, putting it succinctly, I had never seen hype like it, in working in MXGP since 2001.
Yeah, and before we go any further, maybe we set the scene of where we were, because it was, respectively, a big year in both of our careers, because it was my first year covering MXGP full-time, and it was your last year covering MXGP full-time. So we really timed that perfectly. 1 in, 1 out, I guess, was the rule of the MXGP press room.
So how old were you in 2015?
18, 19.
So that was your first full season, or just like first dabble?
No, first full season. First full season, but
right.
Honestly, I hadn't even really dabbled in MXGP. And to be honest with you, the only reason I did was because of Villopoto. It wasn't really my decision at the time because I was still so young and not really involved. But James, who owned MX Vice, as far as I remember, the only reason we did MXGP in 2015 was because Ryan Villopoto is there, so this is a golden opportunity to capitalize on one of the biggest stories the sport has ever seen. So perhaps if Villopoto had never gone to MXGP, I wouldn't be sat here today.
Did you get an interview with RV in those first races?
Yes, because I believe it would have been you. Well, in the first few races, no. But Valkenswaard, which was round 5, the first race that he missed, I believe it would have been you. There was some sort of Monster interview session. I believe it was Monster.
Well, again, kind of getting a gauge for how big of a deal this was. The first Grand Prix of, I want to say, 18, 19 races that year took place in Qatar. And we had like a Monster Energy media event, which I kind of set up. And, the requests to speak to Ryan, about his entry into MXGP was just loaded. I mean, we ended up having sort of an informal media dinner in one of the sort of posh hotels in the center of Doha. And then RV just like sat there and did one-to-ones and, answered questions from journalists afterwards. I mean, he was amazing in that respect. But then I think the one you're talking about was the Grand Prix of Europe, I want to say, at Valkenswaard, maybe round 5 or 6, where he was kind of convalescing from that injury, to can't think of the name of the anatomy now, the bottom of his spine.
Yeah, I Googled
tailbone.
it. Oh, yeah, I Googled it and it just said tailbone injury, but I swear there was a very specific word for the bone, but I can't find that anywhere.
Is it like the sacrum or something?
I think it was a word I'd never heard of. I think it started with
Right.
a P. But for some reason, now that I Google it, that word has disappeared and everywhere just says tailbone, which kind of almost like revisionist history a little bit. I've just ruined all of the credibility I had from my opener.
Anyway, so he was... And it was kind of odd at the time because for a guy with a tailbone injury, he was kind of sitting around a lot and chilling at this Kawasaki event that was taking place at the factory team's workshop, which wasn't far from Valkenswaard at all. And that must be the event that you're talking about, where Ryan again was doing a lot of TV. It was the second race, I think, in Europe. So there was a lot going on, a lot of demand. I think it was set up by Kawasaki. So I was there. I guess you were as well. And it was like a big monster barbecue thing.
Well, two things. I don't remember the exact inner workings of it, but I was meant to be at that event. And for some reason, the tunnel or the train that we were on was delayed, and we didn't make it to the Kawasaki event. And I wouldn't say scolded me for this, but you gave me a slight talking to about having my ducks in a line and like it shouldn't even be left to chance of getting there on time for an event like this. And it's obviously stuck with me because I'd argue I'm one of the more punctual people in motocross to this day. And I even remember
so it was
now.
Educational.
Yes. And the next day, I don't know, I think you may have, from what I remember very loosely, you threw me a bone and the next day set me up with RV under the Kawasaki awning. But
well, there we go.
Not to give you all the credit, you also didn't invite me to the media dinner in Qatar, so that's sad. But not that you should have, because it was MX Vice and my first Grand Prix, so who really cares? And you have to earn your credibility, as I preach time and time again nowadays. So I respect that. I didn't belong there, and I didn't deserve to be there. So did you know that this was going to be your final MXGP season?
2015, because I hadn't missed a GP since 01 to 15, and it was kind of building up to the point where it was getting a bit too much. And also the 2015 season was quite diverse. I mean, we began in Qatar, moved to Argentina, moved to Thailand, then to Argentina, and then into Europe. I think I was writing something ridiculous like 12 to 13 texts, after race day on a Sunday. And then I've been starting to do a bit more in MotoGP as well that year when I could. So it was a little bit like, okay, time for change. And I remember the Motocross of Nations, ONA 2015. That was kind of like, okay, right, we're going to move on and try something a little bit different now. And then I didn't go to the Thai Grand Prix in 2016. And that was kind of the first one I'd missed. And it was very strange being at home trying to follow it on TV, particularly because the TV coverage was quite ropey. But it was also the Grand Prix when Ben Townley decided to, I think, win pole position and then kick off on the whole ethos and structure of MXGP. And I was thinking, typical, there's quite a controversial race or a statement or a very typically forthright view from Ben, and I wasn't there to kind of chase it up.
I think I've told you this before and you didn't believe me, but that Thai GP in 2016 now, the first one that you missed since 2001, was I distinctly remember so many people talking about how weird it was that you weren't in the paddock, that it almost like was I don't want to say a wake-up call. What would you call it? It made me realize the impact that you can have as a media person. It made me realize that there is substance to this job, and you can really become part of the fabric of the series and really be that connected, where if you're missing, it's that bigger story. So that also was kind of my moment where I was like, okay, so if you keep doing this and working hard, then you do get welcomed in. Because as you've discussed many times, your first memory of me from 2015 is that I just didn't talk to anyone at all.
We've discussed your mouse into man transformation a few times on this pod, Lewis, but I remember you being there in 2015, but it was also, as we were trying to say at the top of the show, just a very crazy year. You get to the point, I think I might have told this story before, but Tony Cairoli coming into the season, I mean, he was, a 6 times world champion already by that point? Are my stats wrong? I mean, one in 2009 with Yamaha, and then, 5 times with KTM?
Are you talking 450 specifically, or MX2 as well? Oh, yeah, then 6, yeah. Because he only won one more from 2015 on, that being 2017.
Yeah, so Cairoli was the ultimate top dog in Grand Prix racing at that time. And I think a documentary had come out where he had been slighted somewhat. Or I can remember it might have been Paolo Martin giving a version of the Cairoli story that he didn't quite agree with. And I remember being contacted by Jill Cox, Tony's wife, to help sort of fashion a little press statement he wanted to release just to address this issue. And then, so I helped those guys out, and everybody wanted to have an interview with Tony before Qatar, building up to sort of, 2015 MXGP. And I think he had a slight injury coming into the season, if I remember correctly. But because I'd done the Cairoli family that sort of little favor, they gave me an interview, and I sat in the Four Seasons Hotel in Doha and did a chat with Tony. And that was when he explained how for most of his previous championships, he had been riding at about 70%, and he was fully expecting to having to raise that sort of bar performance up with sort of Ryan Villopoto sitting on the gate. But let's not forget, we also had a couple of other sort of high profile characters there, Lewis, because Gautier Paulin had transferred to HRC. That was probably the Honda team's biggest investment, I think, up until that point. He was sort of a big star, of course, left Kawasaki to find the next step to try and win a championship, and was working with Jean-Michel Bell there, and that didn't go terribly well at all. And then you had, Max Nagl signed for Husqvarna. That turned out to be pretty good for half a season. Clement Desalle was still a major force for Suzuki. And then you had Red Bull KTM, back to being a 3-rider roster with Ken De Dyker and Tommy Sell coming in riding a 350 along with Tony on those strange motorcycles.
Yeah, I guess one to touch on there, because it does set the scene for 2015 a little bit, is Paulin went to HRC for an eye-watering amount of money. I think it was rumoured to be close to what Cairoli was making at KTM, or maybe even more. It was certainly a lot of money for a rider who was not a world champion and had just a couple of Grand Prix wins. But from my memory, and again, similar to 2008, although I was in the paddock, I had no connections and wasn't really talking to people. So we're again going to lean on you a lot here. From my memory, Paulin had an opportunity, or there was talk of him staying at Kawasaki alongside RV, but he felt very slighted by the fact that Kawasaki went in the direction of RV, because prior to that, Paulin was he was with Kawasaki KRT for the entirety of his 450 career.
Yeah, and I think the move, you can understand the reasons behind the move, because Honda were kind of increasing their seriousness and their support to what was sort of, Paolo Martin's team at the time, incrementally every year. And I think everybody thought it was a good move. It was a good match. It was obviously a big spend by Honda to get Paulin over, but he was arguably probably the most high-profile rider in the class outside of sort of Cairoli and Desalle. So it seemed like a sound investment, but it just didn't really work. And Paulin, I think, is one of those athletes that had absolutely everything, like the technique, the focus, the dedication, but he never really sort of found his kind of Desalle group like Cairoli had, or what Desalle had at Suzuki. And that's why he sort of bounced around a little bit, went to Husqvarna. You know, people were questioning whether he should have actually left KRT, you know, because he had like, you know, a very sort of French environment around him there. And I understand he kind of thought, you know, looked at the red of HRC and thought, you know, you don't turn that down if you have an opportunity, especially with like a, you know, a post-career life settling arrangement, you know, if you correctly invested the money. But with hindsight, it didn't work out so well.
I think it's important for context, though, that now, in hindsight, we know how Paulin's career played out. But at the time, end of 2014, he was almost, in my opinion at least, a sure thing to be a world champion, take over from Cairoli. It was, maybe he wouldn't have won in 2015, but I feel like the play from HRC at that time, I think it was their second year back in MXGP, the play from HRC was much wider than that, in my opinion, because Paulin was the Jeffrey Hurlings, the next star. Obviously, it didn't play out that way, no matter the colour of bike beneath him. But I think that goes down as maybe one of the more failed relationships in the history of the sport, because it just didn't work from any angle.
It wasn't a complete disaster. I mean, he finished runner-up in the championship, but he was well over 100 points behind Romain Febvre. You know, I don't think there was much love lost between those two Frenchies at the top of the championship. But I mean, there was only really that high point of the European Grand Prix that we were talking about a moment ago, where Kawasaki had that media event with Villopoto in the sort of southern Netherlands. And it was where, you know, Paulin went 1-1 and everyone thought, okay, we're kicking on now. He's going to be a major player. But then, you know, he never really I think he won 1-1 moto throughout the rest of the season. It just didn't really work.
Yeah, it makes no sense. And the funniest part about all of this is I think Honda or HRC were left with a little bit of a bitter taste in their mouth, because Paulin maybe wasn't so cooperative as it started to spiral in a bad direction. And then when Paulin was looking for a ride like 4 or 5 years later, I know that he went to Honda and was like, oh, from what I see, you fixed everything I wasn't happy with, and I think this is now the place for me. And Honda were kind of like, no, you burnt that bridge quite severely. Like, how about no?
And also he didn't gel with JMB. I mean, I did an interview with Gautier later in his career, and he was far from complimentary, you know, about sort of the French legend's input to that season. And then also, I think, you know, when it comes to Paulin as well, he had this very methodical approach. I mean, I think in the second year of HRC, he was even training with Alden Baker a little bit, or he was trying to, you know, he was making that link so that he was making a statement to say, I'm doing everything I can to show that I'm ready to win races in a championship, you know, so now you guys need to step up. But there was also this kind of inflexibility around HRC at the time. I remember Max Nagl talking about that as well, where, you know, they had options, they had resources, but they couldn't change as much as they wanted on the motorcycle. I mean, from what I hear, I think the situation is radically different now, you know, for the likes of Tim Geiger and Ruben Fernandez. But back then, I still think HRC was at the end of that transition period into becoming this sort of big powerhouse that they are now.
Yeah, so the game of musical chairs pre-2015, Villopoto went to Kawasaki to replace Paulin, who went to HRC to replace Nagl, who went to Husqvarna to replace Rattray, who went to Kawasaki to partner Villopoto. It was all there was a lot of movement. Only really Cairoli, Desalle, and Desalle from the heavy hitters that stayed put, because Febvre was new at Yamaha.
Well, you had Jeremy Van Horbik as well, Yamaha, and in 2014, Van Horbik had, which was his second year in the Premier class, he had his best ever season. He won the Czech Grand Prix. That was his only Grand Prix win on a 450. And Yamaha had a strange team setup that year where they only had one rider in MXGP, and then they had one in MX2, which was Christophe Charlier. But it wasn't a bad season at all. I mean, Van Horbik finished second to Cairoli, even though quite a distant second. And then when Febvre came into the setup, which was quite unexpected, you know, we just saw Van Horbik sort of struggle and collapse a little bit under the weight of expectation, because, you know, maybe we should mention it now, Lewis, but going to Qatar and the start of that season, like I mentioned, the hype was off the chart. There was more media interest than I can remember. There was a lot of people watching that race, that Grand Prix, that first one, just to see how Villopoto would get on against Cairoli. But maybe we should talk a bit about Villopoto, because it was a somewhat auspicious kind of signing by Kawasaki, and it was more of an arrangement than a signing, I'd say.
Yeah, I still remember it, and to give some perspective on what big news this was, I still remember exactly where I was when I caught wind that this was going to happen for 2015. It was that sort of earth-shattering news of that magnitude. I think there was no... Perhaps to begin with, everyone felt as though RV was going to take this incredibly seriously and give it a good run. But I feel like very early on in the season, it became clear that this was more of a farewell tour, or however you want to describe it. But then there was also controversy with him being unhappy with the team, a very French team, by the way, the team that now runs Triumph Factory Racing. When it was KRT, it was a very French team, wasn't it? Not many English speakers over there. Although it was Kawasaki's factory team, it almost had the vibe of a CLS or something because it was so French. So I think that caused some troubles. There were always rumours. Sorry, go on.
There were a couple of... I mean, it wasn't all completely French. I mean, RV brought his practice mechanic over, Tanner, I think his name was, and his actual practice mechanic inside the team setup was Bo Rasmussen, who had been a mechanic at Factory Suzuki. I think he looked after Tanner Leok, maybe Kevin Strybos as well. I mean, Bo really knew his stuff and was, a really sort of compliant person, really professional. But I think Villopoto didn't... I mean, he credited a lot of stuff after his career. I mean, he was saying the way that Zach Osborne really kind of took on MXGP racing was how you had to do it. Throw yourself in and not have any expectations, be completely flexible. And I think, Villopoto wasn't in the right mentality. He didn't really have the kind of that razor focus that had sort of driven him to all that success in the US. And actually, Lewis, I remember a couple of years, what set it up was a couple of years before, I think it might have been 2012, maybe I'm wrong, where he had a knee injury. He was out for the summer and he did had a bit of vacation time, and he came over to the Belgian Grand Prix, which was run at Bastogne. And he was, kind of a guest of honor for Parts and for Thor. He was on the beers, just like, enjoying himself, recovering from sort of knee surgery. But you can tell that, his kind of dalliance with European life and seeing the sights to kind of lay the seed of curiosity. And that's why RV, for however you want to judge his GP career, you have to give him eternal credit for thinking, well, I've got these contracts to appease for 2015. I could just really sever everything, pay the penalties, get out or whatever. But, I fancy giving this a go. And, after it didn't work out, he said he wasn't in the right frame of mind. I read back an interview I made with him, and he said he was only kind of 80% race fit compared to sort of the Oldham Baker perfect sculpture we'd seen, in AMA competition. And I just don't think he really acclimatized as well as he could. He didn't really get settled in Europe. He didn't really have that home. He didn't sort of lay a firm base. And all the kind of temporary nature of it just sort of fed into sort of the approach and also the results. And also, I think it's also worth mentioning that he struggled with the bike. He didn't get it set up anything near like he needed or wanted. And that was also maybe a result of just working with a vastly different group than he'd been used to.
There were all these rumours about maybe a lack of communication or partnership between Kawasaki in America and Kawasaki in Europe. I seem to remember talk of RV wanting stuff specifically that he had in America and it just not being made available to him for whoever was at fault. Do you remember much about that, or have you ever spoken to RV about that?
That's one of those kind of things where it's like he said, it's like there's two different versions of the story of what was provided. I know the team insisted they gave him absolutely everything they needed, but then, RV was also saying, I didn't really have what I needed. And just, he stopped short of saying that the team was unprofessional. He said, I don't think that was fair. He, said they were very good, but also it was just not the setup he was accustomed to. And you needed more time to come in. And he admitted that, taking on sort of Cairoli and Rebel KTM at the time, he just felt that the whole thing was not ready. He was not in the right place to be able to compete. And then when you go to Qatar and everything else. And I think there was stories, from sort of our friends and peers in the US to saying there's a lot of people in the pits at Supercross, not really paying any attention to the practice sessions that were going on. They were kind of glued to, you know, the MXGP TV feed to see what was going on in that sort of very expensively assembled makeshift track at LaSalle International Circuit. And it was a very kind of underwhelming debut, wasn't it? He stalled, you know, in the first moto, which, you know, I think he contests even to this day and says we still don't know what happened on the bike, but it's pretty much impossible to stall those things at that rev range. And what was it, 7.8 or an 8.7 he did in the motos? But it was a case of like, okay, welcome to Grand Prix racing, Ryan. It's not going to be that simple.
Do you think that he underestimated either the competition and if not the competition, maybe he underestimated the situation? Perhaps he thought Kawasaki in America, Kawasaki in Europe, it will be a different group of people in a different setting, but mostly exactly the same. Maybe did underestimate just how hard it is to train and practice in Europe and all of that stuff. Like, do you sense that maybe he bit off more than he could chew, to put it bluntly?
If I had to speculate, I would say yes. And then I think he arrived to some point where he thought, you know, I'm really over this. You know, I can't be doing with it. But then after that sort of tame start in Qatar, he obviously ripped off a moto win in Thailand and took the win at round 2. And I think in the qualifying race on Saturday, he was so far ahead of everybody. And we all thought, okay, this is a little bit more like the Ryan Villopoto we thought we'd be seeing. But then I know there were other GP riders after that Saturday where the temperatures were ferocious at that makeshift track, kind of looking at him thinking, you know, why are you going all out for a qualifying heat? It's not the case now where, you know, they carry points. It was merely to sort out the gate positions. So there was people who were kind of puzzled as to Ryan's approach. And you could say that he was laying down a marker or trying to signal some sort of intent. But yeah, going all out like that on Saturday, it worked for him in the first moto on Sunday. But then I think Tony Cairoli kind of kicked back then and thought, right, okay, I need to make my own little statement then. I think he won the second moto. So, but, you know, that was the overall, and Ryan had like that kind of milestone, I guess you could say.
Yeah, from memory, I kind of remember Villopoto fading somewhat in the second moto on that Sunday in Thailand, and a few GP riders pointing to, yeah, that is why we don't go so hard in the qualification race. But again, I guess that's just something that you have to learn. And realistically, now looking back, doing this for 1 year, committing for just 1 year, the chances of that ever working out are near zero, because you do need a year to understand not only the team, the tracks, the travel, but even the finer details like the format, like the strategy involved with even prepping food for a race like Thailand. There's such a science to that for these MXGP riders that perhaps the American mind cannot comprehend until it's lived it.
Yeah, that's a great point. But I think also, you know, that's why he deserves credit, because he came in with an open mind initially and thought, let's see how it goes. And if he had sort of settled amazingly and, you know, his wife and his family found like a place, then 1 year could maybe have stretched to 2 or 3. I think that kind of, you know, there must have been a fraction of his mindset that was kind of like, you know, let's see what happens here. But I think it was quite quick from the off, and from pre-season testing. Pre-season testing didn't go so well. I mean, they were riding like flooded tracks sort of in northern France, trying to get sort of the suspension dialed in, and it was a wee bit bumpy. And you mentioned Tyler Rattray. Tyler had been drafted into the team. You know, he hadn't been doing too badly in MXGP, but he was pretty much there as a sidekick for Ryan. And I think, you know, Tyler managed like a best moto finish of 6th throughout 2015. So he was kind of like the B rider. He was there just to help Ryan acclimatize. But then Tyler had been in the US for he left in the end of 2008. So he had been there quite a while. He had to sort of reacclimatize to European sort of life himself. So it was just not a prime environment for Villopoto to succeed ultimately.
You know, Rattray has kind of fallen off the face of the earth since he retired. I would love to hear his perspective on that 2015 season, because he was, to put it bluntly, abysmal. There was no good part of his season. For a rider as good as he is, or was, it was just nowhere near what anyone would have expected. And having a better understanding of Europe and then RV as a person, I feel like he would have the key to all of the speculation, the unknown facts that went on behind the scenes, he would kind of have the best perspective to talk about what happened that year. But he was really just a hired friend, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's incredibly professional, and his preparation as well is first rate. I mean, there's many teams sort of testifies to the way that he throws himself at something. So I don't think you could really point the finger at him and say he was awful. He was a solid kind of top 10 rider at times. Made it all the way through the season as well, and he had to carry the team by himself. When Villopoto sort of bowed out around 4, so that couldn't have been too easy either.
No, but looking at results, I'm pulling them up here. Rattray was, I would say, in the top 10 in 40% of the motos. Did I just think too much of Rattray at that point? I would think that Rattray would be a top 7 rider with a nice amount of 4 podiums across the season. Not a mainstay in 13th place with an occasional 9th now that everyone's injured, which is eventually where we got to in 2015 MXGP. Yeah,
maybe a fair point. He also had his own injury problems. I'm just trying to argue his case a little bit. But yes, Lewis, it was a disaster really for Kawasaki. And also, going back to what you were mentioning about the transition for RV, you can't forget the role that Monster Energy played there. And they were, just a couple of years into being the title sponsors, the MXGP series. So they also facilitated a lot of those arrangements for him. And that was also unprecedented, for having a sponsor that big, helping to formulate like a cast list for MXGP. But there was a lot of excitement because you had that Paulin move, you had Desalle, who was still so strong at Suzuki. And then it just meant that you had this French guy who was obliged to step into the premier class because his birthday was December 31st. So he missed out on one more year in MX2 where he'd finished 3rd in the championship by just one day. And, he came into it under the radar and ended up blitzing everybody by the end of the season. And I know you've said this before, but I just want to get your opinion on Romain Febvre's 2015 championship, because you kind of felt it was a little bit of a gift. Is that right or not?
I can't remember how I felt at the time, but now looking back in these notes that I've made, I've genuinely put Romain Febvre won a moto with everyone bar RV there, which was Matterly Bazin. He won the second moto, and at that point, Desalle, Cairoli, Nagl were all healthy, Paulin. So, would he have won the title? Probably not, but he was certainly in the picture and a contender pre everyone's injuries. I think had everyone stayed healthy, he probably would have won multiple GPs the rest of the way. Maybe it wouldn't have been enough, but I do think that everyone, maybe myself, looks back on 2015 and thinks that it played out perfectly for Febvre. But he was superb, even from round 1, really. From memory, I'll look now quickly. Yeah, from memory, even in Thailand, he went 3-4. And Febvre was... Now, maybe you can correct me here, but you mentioned his age. I remember interviewing Febvre at the 2015 Motocross of Nations, again, set up through you, which is becoming a theme of this podcast.
I just opened the door for you.
Yes,
all the
you
way,
really. Now that I'm talking out loud, I'm like, wow. And actually, going back to the quiet Lewis, I distinctly remember I was interviewing Febvre. And then you came over and said 1 minute or something, and I just shut the interview down because I was like, I didn't want to overstep. I didn't want to take too much time. I just was so worried about doing the wrong thing that I was like, we're done. And then I remember you coming up to me and was like, you could have done another question. I was like, I don't know. Anyway, and I remember in that interview, Febvre saying that he petitioned the FIM to stay down for another year because his birthday is New Year's Eve, so he was mere hours from being allowed another year in MX2. And it's so funny to think that he petitioned for something which ultimately may have derailed the rest of his career. This ended up perfectly. Also ended up perfectly for Yamaha. You mentioned it with Van Hoorbeek, but 2014, Van Hoorbeek did incredible. He was second in pretty much every race. That's the best way to describe his season, bar his Czech Grand Prix win. But that put Yamaha back on the map because that started to put Yamaha back on the map. It was mainly Febvre. But Febvre got that ride, from my memory, as just Yamaha didn't really have much pull in the paddock. And it was kind of just Febvre's the last guy left and Yamaha have a seat. So they just got together. It wasn't, from what I remember, as if Yamaha had a pick of the lot, saw something in Febvre. Yamaha, the best way to put it perhaps, pre-2014 were going the way of Suzuki. No, they lost Monster Energy title sponsorship. They had no results to speak of. If you go and Google Jeremy Van Hoorbeek 2014 and look at the photos, he is riding what looks like a stock Yamaha. There isn't much sponsorship on there. The jersey doesn't have many logos. It really seemed like Yamaha was going in a very bad direction. But Van Hoorbeek set some sort of a bar, and then Febvre really relaunched for manufacture in a sense, because Febvre kick-started the rebirth of the Monster Energy title sponsorship later this year. So really a funny... Basically, Febvre, Yamaha, and all involved in that corner needed this 2015, and it worked out perfectly for all.
Yeah, and also just for some context on Yamaha at that point, you had Tony Cairoli winning the championship in his first year in 2009 while under Desalle colours. And then, of course, Desalle and Cairoli went shipped to KTM in 2010. And in 2009, it was when the financial crisis year was really eating into motocross, and Yamaha had to make some hard decisions. You know, they stuck with their factory regimented structure with Michele Rinaldi running the YRD tuning division for Yamaha Motor Europe. That meant there was no kind of funding to be able to supply Desalle with machinery or also take on any of the budget requests for riders. So, yep, they went to KTM. That was that story, 2010 to 2014, 350 SXF, titles galore, and a dominant era in MXGP racing. Yamaha were coming out of that in 2014. As you said, Van Hoorbeek had a great year in 2014. And then towards the end of 2014, you had Romain Febvre, who was riding a Husqvarna in MX2, doing very well. Like I said, finishing third in the championship, won a couple of Grand Prix. So that kind of talent we'd seen 2 to 3 seasons earlier, he broke his leg, I think, which sort of stunted him a little bit at one point. But he was bubbling up. But Febvre was really concerned about riding a 450 in 2015 because he knew he had to move out of MX2. He was angling at the KTM group because they had Husqvarna and also the orange bikes at that time to ride a 350. That for him, that was his perfect transition year. Get me on a 350, I can get used to the Premier class and I can build my way up. And then Yamaha were kind of looking at Febvre thinking, do we take him or do we invest in Sean Simpson, who's a rider we'll talk about in a moment as well, because he had a great 2015 season. And in the end, Febvre was the first choice and Simpson had to wait if Romain turned down the offer or not. In the end, Febvre, who was being advised by, a guy who was quite a high-profile manager for quite a few athletes, Gerard Vallat, he signed the deal. And one of the ingenious things that Rinaldi and Yamaha did that year was say, here's a stock YZ450F, take the bike and ride it. When you feel you're comfortable, then we'll start to build up a factory bike piece by piece. And Febvre just rode and rode and rode. And I think he actually broke his arm at one point, which sort of put a stop to him for 3 or 4 weeks. While he got that injury fixed in the winter and the build up to 2015. But he just rode, got used to the bike. And, that grounding that he put in the off season was really the foundation for his championship, because then when Yamaha built up that factory bike for him and then kind of the pieces fell into place, he was awesome. I mean, he just had the right mentality, the right approach. Van Hoorbeek kind of melted mentally a little bit by having this teammate that was so on fire. And I think Jeremy crashed as well in Thailand and got a concussion, which was like a terrible start to the season. And he was like on the back burner. So, that was, like you say, the Yamaha resurgence. And Febvre went on to win the championship. He won his first moto, like you say, in Matterley Basin. I think the following Grand Prix was Villars-sur-Caux, the French GP. All eyes were on him, and he won that. That was his first Grand Prix win in the Premier class. And that was it, just went on to win the championship. And he was Yamaha's first champion since 2009 in Cairoli, but then the first title for the factory team since 2008 with Phillips. It was like a bit of a tour de force. And I just remember being at Glen Helen for the final round of the season. Still the Grand Prix, we don't know if it existed or not, because there was barely anybody there. So did it exist? But I remember, him racing against Cooper Webb. and Febvre just coming down those big hills and swooping around the outside, taking a very bizarre line and passing the American and just making it all look like kids play. And then he went to, of course, One for the Nations and crowned a perfect season.
I've never heard, and I'm pretty sure it has never been publicised, that Febvre's ride almost went to Sean Simpson. I swear that has never been said publicly, because that is definitely new information to me. So
yeah, Sean was in the running. He was riding really well. I mean, he had won his first Grand Prix in 2014 as the privateer. And then in 2015, he was back under sort of Roger McGee's Hitachi KTM, privateer setup. And he had a great year. I don't know if we want to talk about him now, but he was, his results and finishing fourth as a privateer in the World Championship standings meant that he, rightfully was on some people's radar.
I just really want to underline the fact that, again, now with all of this data, we know who Romain Febvre is. At this point in 2015, this was about as surprising as a world champion could get. No one had him pegged, especially with Villopoto, Cairoli, Paulin, Desalle. No one had Febvre even listed as a podium contender. So if you want an upset or a fairy tale story or whatever you want to label it, this was it. I don't know if we'll ever get such an underdog story again, because it was so unlikely, and really, the pieces of the puzzle just fell into place perfectly for whatever reason. I don't think there's a way for anyone to replicate that. It just happened.
Yes, I feel like Majora was the changing of the guard. Was 2015 the year where he was running the Yamaha anniversary livery?
Yeah.
And then crashed and bent the bars, but still got up and won the Grand Prix. He was riding that kind of very distinctive yellow scheme. But then on Saturday, in the qualifying races, when Tony Cairoli had crashed and fractured his arm just above the elbow, I think, tried to ride on in the next couple of Grand Prix. And also it was quite symbolic as well that David Phillips, who had been, the Yamaha factory team's last world champion in 2008, winning the world championship in Faenza, like we sort of mentioned in our last show on 2008, was second place in that first moto at Majora, which was his home track, and in which sort of the veteran Italian was desperate to have a good performance. So that was one of the weirdo kind of results of 2015, seeing him finish up there like he did. But, that Grand Prix was all about Febvre. And I think his sort of statement to say, right, you weren't talking about me with Villopoto, you weren't talking about me and Nagl or Cairoli, and now here I am.
I think when I look back, one of the things that surprises me, even remembering just how dominant Febvre was, after his first podium at Matterley-Basin, which is where his first moto win came, he didn't miss a podium again that season, 13 in a row. And although I have clear memories of just how much he took control, that still surprises me. I would have said that he missed the podium once, twice, a fourth place here. No, he, from the moment he started winning, he didn't stop. And in fact, when you look at that, it really is quite surprising that he hasn't won since.
Yeah, in Villars-sur-Glâne, that French GP, when he won, I kind of thought, okay, he's on it now. We have to count this guy as a protagonist this season. And that Grand Prix was really strange. It's been incredibly weather hit over the years. But then I remember in 2015, that was also the first time when there was whispers of Alpine Stars testing data for their airbag system.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that shows you how long ago it was. Yeah, 2015, that was kind of like a bit of a secret in the paddock at the time. And we were trying to dig up stories on it, but it was so kind of primitive. Because A-Stars were just attaching sensors to riders' chest protectors to try and understand an algorithm as to how riders react and their behavior on a motorcycle. So laying the basis for how an airbag could work. But it was also that Grand Prix, Lewis, where we lost Clement Desalle, and Desalle had been competitive. I think he'd been on quite a few of he only missed the podium once in the first 7 rounds or something. He was right up there. I think he was actually only a couple of points behind Max Nagl, who was leading the championship at that time. And the crash he had, I think it was on Saturday, damaged his shoulder, his right shoulder and his left knee. That was it, and I think he came back 3 or 4 races later at the Czech Republic, amazingly went 3-3. But then, he dislocated his shoulder again at Lommel and needed surgery. So it was just like unfortunately, there's been a couple of seasons like that for Clement where he started so strong, looked like he's going to be the main title guy, and then just one sort of incident ruins the thing.
Yeah, incredibly, Desalle didn't win a GP in 2015, which perhaps causes everyone to forget his effectiveness. But if you look at his moto scores to start, he went 2-2, 2-2, 1-3, 3-4, 4-3, 2. Like, he was a picture of consistency. And it's funny, 2015 is so poignant, it's so difficult to analyze because there are so many layers to it, as we almost had 2 championships in one. But looking back now, for Desalle, who never won a world title, the same for Paulin, the same for Nagl, 2015 must be the year they all look back on, and if only I could stay healthy. Well, not in Paulin's case because he was healthy, but if only Desalle or Paulin specifically had brought their 2014, 2013, 2012 selves into 2015, they would have got the one. Essentially, their entire careers, they were waiting for Cairoli to get injured or make a misstep. And Cairoli finally did, but they just weren't positioned to take advantage, which is kind of the cruel scope of sport, I guess.
Yeah, and Tony's start of the championship was a bit iffy as well. He had a big crash at Valkenswaard for that sort of European Grand Prix in Holland, early doors. And was it round 4 or round 5?
5.
And, and he tweaked his wrist, I think, because he only finished 7th in the second moto. So he DNF'd and then went 7th, so he was slightly injured there. And, it wasn't kind of the dominant Cairoli we had seen. And also he was starting to flip between the 350 and the 450. That was kind of like the time when the 350's days were almost numbered. And, you had Tommy Sell coming into the team. Tommy brought his kind of personality into Red Bull KTM. De Dijker was having problems of injury, I think. Loss of form as well. He was riding the 450. But, Tommy helped create a decent team environment there, but then had that huge crash in Thailand for round 2 and suffered a concussion, I think. I'm not sure the exact
fractured
nature of the
his
injury.
vertebra.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Or
so that was a
vertebra.
pretty serious one. Yeah, and I don't know if he'd injured his thumb as well at some point.
So when I actually had to go back and Google all of Tommy's injuries that year because there were so many. So I wanted to figure out what they were. And so I've got it written here. Fractured vertebra to start, came back, dislocated his shoulder. Then there was another scare when he had a deep cut in his arm. I too distinctly remember him struggling with a thumb injury, but could find no trace of it. And I even Googled Tommy 2015 thumb injury and can't find trace of it. And I don't know why, because my main memory from that season is Tommy struggling with a thumb injury. But I did find a 2014 thumb injury. So I don't know.
There was definitely one. It was like at the Qatar Grand Prix, the first round of the season. I remember him being intensely pissed off because he put a lot of work into the off season, as they all had. But then was nursing this thumb injury. I can't remember if it was 14
No, that
or
is
15.
correct. Yeah, no, that is correct. 100%. That was what. Yes, 100%. That is what happened. There may be no trace of it on the internet, but 100% that was 2015. And yeah, to your point about Cairoli, it was Spain round 6. I want to say that was a week after the Valkenswaard crash. The week after the Valkenswaard crash, where he kind of made the firm move to the 450, which was also, I think it's a fascinating perspective, and maybe this is reading too much into it, but I think it's a fascinating look into his perspective of not panicking, but you've got RV there, that cast doubt, the situation is very different. Suddenly the 350 maybe isn't good enough when it was good enough for so long. Now suddenly it's the time to start flirting with other machines. That just tells me that in 2015 the apple cart was upset and everyone far and wide was searching a little bit for this missing piece that did or did not exist.
But also 2015 was the year that KTM finally cracked the 450 SXF. That was a new chassis, a new generation of motorcycle. Ryan Dungey, of course, used it then to sort of on his ascendancy in AMA Supercross. But I think that the gap between the performance and the potential of the 350 and 450 became much closer in that season. And I think Tommy, for his part in Red Bull KTM, was sort of flogging it as best as he could. Desperately unlucky with injury as well. And then Glenn Coldenhoff, who we can talk about as well, was a rookie in 2015 MXGP, was pretty much just like a top 10 guy on the Suzuki, but then had that sort of flash of brilliance at the Latvian Grand Prix and took the overall win. He was being coached that year by Joel Smets, who was a pretty integral part of the Suzuki setup at that time. who were fielding, of course, Clement Desalle and Kevin Strybos, who was having his own injury troubles with a wrist and thumb as well. But and then Coldenhoff, I remember getting the nod to join Red Bull KTM for 2016 as part of that 3-rider lineup, purely based on like his personality and his work ethic. I mean, the fact that Glenn wanted to be part of Red Bull KTM was enough for Pit Byra. And you have to remember as well that Cairoli getting injured and breaking his arm in Majora, he sort of soldiered on. I mean, he was trying to make a fist of it. He was trying to gather points. I think it was at Latvia where, he was sort of coming back to the team morning, parking the bike, and then just sort of collapsing on the step, just in agony, trying to, race with this fractured arm. And he was posting pictures on Instagram of just like one arm normal, another one swollen and blue. And he thought, okay, look, there's only so long this is going to go on. And eventually, he decided to step back, and he missed a couple of Grand Prix, for the first time since 2008 when he sort of knackered his knee in South Africa. So it'd been a long stint and a success. And also I recall Pit Byra saying towards the end of 2015 that, Cairoli, for everything that he had done for the team and for the brand and for the sport, he deserved, time to break away from the sport, heal up and get healthy again. He had earned that credit.
Yeah, it is crazy because it feels like towards the end of Cairoli's career, and I think this happens to everyone, but there were a lot of niggling injuries. It seemed like almost every week it was like, oh, Cairoli's dealing with this. You almost forget that in his prime, if you want to call it that, he had an incredible run of just turning up and logging win after win after win. I think that does get overshadowed a little bit by how the latter stages of his career went. And
also when he needed to turn it up, he did.
Yeah. That goes back to the comment he gave you about having risen 80% or 70% in years prior. But it is almost insane that we've gone this far without talking about Max Nagl, but also speaks to just how chaotic and wild this championship picture was. So coming in, everyone's talking about Villopoto and Cairoli, naturally. Then Desalle and Paulin are getting a good chunk of attention as the guys who were always chasing Cairoli. And then out of nowhere, maybe not out of nowhere, because it was always within him, but not to this degree, Max Nagl comes out, goes 1-1 in Qatar, and then maintains that form all of the way until he gets injured at round 10. And he never replicated that again. He came back the next year with the same team and just wasn't the same guy. And to this day, I'm not really sure where that came from or what the reason was. But Max Nagl was the star of 2015, and had everyone stayed healthy, maybe Villopoto or Cairoli or Desalle wouldn't have been your champion because they wouldn't have been able to go past Max Nagl.
Yeah, and also Max, I think, was the person showing what that 450 platform at KTM could do. I mean, he was a very sort of formidable package in the first part of the season. But he was riding for the IceOne team in Husqvarna colours, and you could feel that the pressure and the tension was mounting. I think he won 3 of the first 5 races, or there was some statistic where he was leading the championship and doing incredibly well. But then by the time we got to Germany, I think there was a story where he was trying to pass Evgeny Bobryshev, who himself had a pretty decent season. I think he finished 3rd in the championship. Yeah. And Bobryshev kind of got in his way or was on his line, and Nagl was screaming at him and getting hysterical. And Bobry was like, "Well, I'm racing. I'm trying to do my own thing here. It's not like I'm a backmarker." And it was just a little sign that there was some tension and some pressure going on there. And then, of course, Nagl just broke his collarbone, I think, at Tuchental, of all places for him.
I think it was his foot.
Oh, okay. It was a breakage, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I believe the first lap of the qualifying race. So, yeah, just a first lap incident. I laugh when I think about all of these new viewers that MXGP would have had in 2015 who have no idea, have never followed names like Desalle or Paulin. They have a brief idea of who Cairoli is just because of what he's done. And they tune into Qatar and this little German by the name of Maximilian, of all names, who... Truth be told, Max Nagl looked very old school European with his style, the gear. He was the stereotypical European rider who kind of stood out amongst the newfound American style. I just imagine the mass confusion by these newfound fans who are trying to figure out who this guy is and why on earth he's winning.
It was said he had a lot of injuries. I think he counted that he had broken his collarbone like 13 times or something. And he was one of those riders as well. Where I remember like a former mechanic saying to me that they could tell when he walked into the awning at the beginning of a weekend by his pallor and his complexion and the way he was handling himself, whether it was going to be a good GP or not. And, but then peers of his time, like Sean Simpson, saying as well that when Nagl was on it, he was uncatchable. I mean, he had a pace that was just nobody could live with. And of course, he was a fantastic starter. He was sort of like the Jorge Prado of his day, like a small guy who just was able to really utilize that famous KTM torque and really made it count.
I did never put two and two together and think about the fact that Nagl was a case study for Cairoli, that the Austrian 450 was now competitive and the way to go. I never put two and two together with those things, but it actually makes perfect sense that the guy Cairoli was trying to beat was on the same bike in essence, just a more powerful version, and would have been that, understandably, would have opened some questions and some intrigue. Never put that together. See, my mind was not developed in 2015 enough. I was very black and white with what I was seeing. So those were your contenders. Nagl, Cairoli, Desalle, and RV. And all of those guys got injured. So the fifth contender, Febvre, came storming through. And actually, just for context, the GP winners that year were Febvre, Paulin, Simpson, Nagl, Cairoli, Koldenhoff, and Villopoto. Which, again, reading back is just a bizarre list of names. You've got Cairoli, Villopoto, and then Koldenhoff and Simpson. Like, it almost doesn't seem like that can be one season. But this was what MXGP just desperately needed, because there were so many years of the same old, of Cairoli winning inevitably, Desalle and Paulin knocking on the door, but never really being able to mount a serious charge. From 2010 to, say, 2014, MXGP was in this rut, I would say, this competitive rut. 2015, arguably, MXGP is now still riding the wave that started in 2015, because from 2015 on, it became mass hysteria and unpredictable, many contenders.
I think it's a great summary, but I think from 2017, you entered into the Hurlings era. And even though Tony Cairoli took his last championship in 2017, Hurlings was coming. And then, of course, he unveiled that season of brilliance in 2018. But then you're right, Lewis. I think 2015 ended the Cairoli dominance and a little bit of that staleness that dropped into MXGP, just because you had new names coming up, expected names that should have succeeded and fallen by the wayside, expensive experiments that didn't quite come off. We were into the fourth year of the qualification race. So that was, it wasn't a new thing at all, but I think it was still a haphazard thing that riders were trying to get their head around, especially the older ones. I think Desalle actually had his injury in the qualifying race in Villar on the Saturday. So it was, it was a period where MXGP pivoted, and I think the extra attention that Villopoto brought just meant it had like a bigger audience, and then just this wild shit was going on all the time. And yeah, you could say that the championship was pretty much in the stranglehold of Febvre, but I can remember quite clearly the pressure that he was under as the season was winding down and he was coming close to grabbing that title. I mean, he became like a Monster Energy athlete at the final Grand Prix where he won it in Assen, and then before going to the US. Glen Helen as well. Just some of the tracks we had, the events. Simpson, we should speak about him because his 1-1 at Lommel came a little bit out of nowhere if you're a general MXGP fan, but Sean has always been one of the best sand riders in the Premier class, and he showed that again when KTM gave him factory equipment for the last couple of races, and he won at Assen. I think his results were just off the chart. Towards the end of the season, he went sort of ridiculous. He went like 2-1 or something. Actually, I've written it down. Let me look. He went 5-3, 1-3, 2-2, and then before wrecking himself slightly in Glen Helen. But again, for a privateer, that was like pretty outstanding stuff, and to rise to fourth in the championship was no mean feat. Yeah,
and again, talking about patterns that started in 2015 and live on to this day, I think you could argue there was a brief spell of Yamaha in there, but you could argue that Sean's strong ties to KTM and a very respectful partnership that is still in place now with an EMX 250 team started in 2015. I think KTM really saw a value in Sean as a person, far beyond what he could bring to the table results-wise. You would know better than me, but that's at least the impression I got.
Yeah, definitely. And also, don't forget, I think, he eventually got that Yamaha supported ride at Wilvo for a couple of seasons, in 2017. Managed to win as well for them in sort of that utterly bizarre race in Indonesia where it was just like a one moto bog. That was incredibly tense watching that one. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that foundation with KTM, he had been a Red Bull KTM rider, of course, had that huge injury in 2009. And sort of, he could have stayed with the factory team in the Premier class, but decided at a very young age, I think at 22, to jump into MXGP and had a decent career. But 2015, I would say, was probably the highlight just in terms of the way he outperformed or exceeded expectations, certainly.
And then sticking with a British vibe, I wanted to talk about Tommy because obviously when he left MX2, he was Hurling's greatest competitor, tipped to do great things on a 450. It never quite happened, but 2015 could have and should have been the year that he kind of turned that situation around. He was so fast from memory on that KTM 350, so he really worked to integrate himself into the KTM family, this very Italian team, quite foreign from anything he'd ever experienced. But from what I remember, he lived in a camper throughout the winter, which is an RV, if you're American listening to this, at the team workshop, and really went all in, realizing that this was maybe his last chance to prove his worth. And the speed, again, if it wasn't for injury, maybe he could have been a guy like Sean or even Febvre who's winning GPs unexpectedly and setting a positive trend for the future. But injury just stopped him from taking advantage of that. And I think that's one of the great shames of 2015 because Latvia, for instance, I distinctly remember him being so fast on that day. But it just never turned into any sort of result. And understandably, KTM couldn't re-sign him. He went to Dixon, and we know the troubles that come with that, and that was almost the end of Tommy as we know him.
Yeah, and it would have been a great story because, he finished, runner-up in the championship in 2008 with Red Bull KTM, went to the US, that didn't quite go as successfully as he wanted. I think it got to the point where he's even suing KTM for the collapse of their factory team in the United States before it became what it is today under the sort of the control of Roger Da Costa and Pit Byra. But then, Pit Byra sort of signed him again, brought him back into the Red Bull KTM setup just to sort of finish the story, really, to try and chase that second success. And for me, it's still unbelievable that Seoul never won in the Premier class.
Never had a podium.
I know. I'm sure we've said this before on the podcast, but that should have been the year. But then seeing how fast he was and then that scary crash in Thailand, you kind of thought, this isn't going to go well.
Yeah, and that is on YouTube. So if you want to see that for some context, just Google Tommy Searle 2015 Thailand crash. But yeah, and then I think because that's what made me put two and two together. I believe the Thailand crash was partly blamed on the weak thumb and the lack of grip strength and all of that. So it really did just, it was a case of dominoes falling from round one on. But it wasn't. You can look at Tommy's 450 career and say how shocking it was that he didn't have a podium, but it wasn't because he was slow. Like I say, his speed in 2015 will live on with me forever because I just remember being just in awe of how good he was, and this is it. And it just never translated to anything. He had one qualifying race win in 2013, I want to say, at the Lausitzring on a 450, but apart from that, not much to speak of on a 450, but again, not because he just didn't have it or sucked. A bizarre case of someone who just never quite got on the right track after being on the right track for so long. It is funny, though.
Yeah,
I do feel... Oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, like you say, there were riders where you thought, what happened to you? Where did you go? I mean, you would have expected more of Van Hoorbeek, for example, after 2014. You would have expected. I mean, Evgeny Bobryshev had a great season, but maybe a bit more. Paulin as well, just winning one Grand Prix, that was a pretty poor return. Tyler Rattray could have pointed the finger out and said, "Listen, we needed some more results from you." So and Ken Dyker as well, who had sort of been this very sort of random rider anyway, that could be sort of utterly brilliant on one day and then just like this. Top 10 guy on the next. I mean, he was riding sort of Red Bull KTM 450 and that didn't work out either.
It is just 2015. will live on with me as just this crazy year that I think the best way to put it is it just turned the apple cart on its head in MXGP. The established order, everything we thought we knew was out the window. And I tell people a lot, I actually, and again, I guess it wasn't luck because it was RV influenced, but I feel very fortunate that my career started in 2015 rather than years prior, because there wasn't much happening in comparison the years before. And 2015 was just this, maybe the craziest title, or not even title fight, because it wasn't a title fight, but this the craziest situation that we've seen in a championship. Because in reality, you look at the results, Febvre was 150 points clear around there. It should have been the most boring season ever. He ended the season with 13 podiums in a row. We lost RV. We should be talking about 2015 as an incredibly boring and disappointing season, because what we wanted and dreamt of, and perhaps will never get a chance at again, never materialized. And yet it has this magic.
It was incredibly exciting because, you know, you had that race in Qatar, and even though you didn't have big public attendance, that you never did for that race, there was so much buzz around the Grand Prix. And then moving to Argentina, that was the first time we went to the track at Neuquén. And, Villopoto needed his own security detail just to get around the pits. I don't know if you can remember. I mean, like Casey Stoner was there as well, hanging out. There was just like this big swell of attention going on. And RV tells this funny story of driving back to the airport, and some guy on a scooter was next to the car, frantically trying to chase the car and get his attention, and ended up cartwheeling off the road and disappearing into the trees with the front forks of the bike snapped off completely. And then, moving from there, we went to sort of, that was actually round 3, but in Thailand. And that's what I want to ask you, Lewis, about, whether that was the weirdest Grand Prix you may have ever been to. But Thailand as well was obviously Villopoto's success. That was his marker. And then, it was interesting seeing his reaction to racing Arco di Trento, which is, to some people, is your ultimate definition of a classic old school Italian hard pack track. And I think it was a lot worse in terms of track prep in 2014 and 15 than it was, as it currently is now, where it's been reversed, and there's quite a lot of, there's more attention paid to track prep, you could say. But back then it was pretty, it was a pretty hard introduction to typically adverse European tracks.
I remember my experiences in 2015 fondly, because as a lifelong fan, this was my first time to see a lot of these tracks. And although Trentino was newer, even still, it was established at that point. So like going to each of these venues for the first time, I remember making a point to walk the track every Friday just to take it in a little bit and understand. And that looks bigger than TV, I actually didn't go to Thailand or Argentina that year though, because of funds. I've just remembered. So I did the full season bar 2. So I did Qatar, again, because of RV's first GP. It was kind of had to be done to set the precedent for me doing the season. And then no funds for Thailand or Argentina. And then, Trentino was round 4, so I was back in. But although the season could be looked at as a disappointment because we didn't get the racing that we wanted, I did want to say to everyone, if you go and either find it on MXGP TV or at worst find the highlights on YouTube, the second moto in Argentina that year, we had Nagl, Desalle, Cairoli and Villopoto separated by 4 seconds at the finish. And I can clearly, it's a core memory for me being sat at home watching that race, because I just remember being sat there going, this is it. This is exactly what we all wanted. Just a whole moto of 4 riders just swapping positions, tailing each other, stalking each other. Yeah. So if you want a reference point for what 2015 could have been, find the second moto from Argentina for sure.
The wackiest Grand Prix for me was actually Thailand, because we turned up to this place, Nakhon Chai.
I would never try and pronounce that.
Yes, it's basically a collection of syllables, and it was a kind of a temporary build across like a small airport or runway. And full props to sort of Krytos, who was the Thai FIM representative, and who was pretty much the power behind the Thai Grand Prix at Sriracha before that. This was another edition trying to get a bit closer to Bangkok and attract a bigger crowd. It had the RV effect, so there were quite a few people there, but the heat was absolutely brutal. We had some big crashes. I mean, Tommy Searle was one. Julian Lieber as well, I think, had a big smash in MX2. A lot was expected of him that season, but that was a pretty big one. You can find that on YouTube as well. And I just remember, I think it must have been towards the end of the first motor, or actually, would it have been the first? In MX2, you had riders crashing maybe 30 to 40 yards from the finish line. It was just one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, within sight of the flag, and riders were just collapsing because of heat exhaustion. I remember Jeremy Sewer dropping his Suzuki, and I was standing trackside, and he just kind of staggered towards me and then collapsed at my feet, and I was thinking, what do I do? Luckily, this medic ran over and started to remove his helmet and help him breathe and have some air. Jordi Tixier then sort of fell off right either before him or right after him in the same place, and I was kind of looking around thinking, are they trying to avoid something? But then Tixier was carted off to the medical center, and they tried to hydrate him. And I think under the FIM rules at the time, that meant he couldn't enter the second moto. And he actually got aggressive, I think, with the circuit staff. And there was a big fuss about that afterwards, because he semi-assaulted one of the medics because he was adamant that he wanted to get back on the track and race the second moto, because he was defending world champion at the time. He sort of won it with Red Bull KTM in 2014 in the famous Jeffrey Hurling's episode of the broken femur, and then was riding a Kawasaki for CLS in 2015. And that was all like a big story as well at the Thai GP. But just seeing riders battling the heat and getting all that way and then just falling off within view of the finish line was just utterly bizarre.
Yeah, 2015 Thailand is a fun pub quiz reference as well, because in Jeremy Sewer's incredible run of never missing a Grand Prix in his professional career, he didn't start the second Thailand moto in 2015. So that is in fact the one singular moto that he'd missed. So that doesn't take away, he did start every Grand Prix. I've had this conversation with him. I count it as you have to start Moto 1 to count as taking part in the Grand Prix. So it doesn't ruin his record, but it is a small little blemish in that incredible run for our friend Jeremy.
Well, he was 20 to 30 yards away from making the finish line in the first moto. And, maybe one day he can sort of describe his account of it. But
would he remember? I don't know.
I don't. Yeah.
I'd love to know if he remembers staggering towards you.
Yeah.
And maybe we can get to the bottom of why he was staggering towards you. Did he think you had a background in medicing?
I was standing next to the little straight section on the approach to the jump. And I just thought, he's going to collapse. What do I do? Do I catch him, or do I, what do I do here? I mean, I had a bottle of water in my photography vest. I felt like just throwing it on him. But riders were, it was strange. It was a strange paddock, and they were congregating in one sort of central office. It was like a big rider meeting, but it was the only place that was air conditioned. So they were all bunched together there. And it was, just kind of a bit of a ramshackle event, to be honest.
Do we want to talk about MX2, or do you want to just talk about some random 2015 memories?
We should mention MX2 because that was the Gautier Championship.
Yeah, and also in the same vein, we were in this period of Cairoli dominance in MXGP. I think, was it called MXGP at the time, or was it still MX1? I think it was MX. I think this may have even been the first year of MXGP, or second. Anyway, beside the point. We were also in this period of Hurling's dominance, although he didn't win the previous title in MX2. So we entered MX2 also thinking, let's hope Hurling's doesn't just win every race and this isn't incredibly boring. And instead, what we got, similar to Tommy Searle's season, actually, so those two names collide once again. Hurling's just had injury after injury after injury, little, until we finally had big. And then what we ended up with was essentially a 5-way battle for the championship, with, say, 6 rounds to go, I think. Like, even Sewer, who that season wasn't quite the rider we know now, he was more like a top 5 mainstay, not really a podium regular. Because of his consistency, he was at least within a shot or within striking distance in the final 6 rounds. Like, it really was anyone's game. Paul's Jonas, he had a good shot. I believe that was his rookie year, maybe?
No, it wasn't his rookie year.
It was his first year with Red Bull KTM.
Yes. Yeah. And he was unexpectedly like you say, a title contender. It wasn't really that many riders. It was just him and Gautier really coming into the final rounds. But then he had a crash, I think, after making a fantastic start at IceOne for the penultimate Grand Prix. And that put the points emphasis in very much favour of Gautier, who wrapped up the title in Glen Helen. But Gautier, that was his second season for Honda. It was the season where he took his first moto win and his first Grand Prix win. And then, that was it. That was the start, because in 2016, of course, he won the championship in the Premier class and sort of went back to back and made that very memorable milestone in MXGP history. But Jonas was there, Max Anstey, Lewis. I mean, Anstey is a rider. It kind of made me smile a little bit hearing some of his current interviews in Supercross, where it's been talked about, his consistency's been talked about, because I've never really had Max down as a consistent rider.
No.
He's had riders to spin these flashes of absolute brilliance and supremacy, but then, inexplicable reverses the following week or the following couple of Grand Prix. And I think he won something silly like 9 motos or something in the second half of the championship.
I was on the phone to Max last night and I said to him, I'm doing a 2015 MXGP podcast tomorrow, which means I will be saying that was your championship. Like, he was, so again, Thai GP reference, he missed for Thai GP. I believe he got injured midweek though. He came back, wasn't really a factor because it was trending in a Hurling's direction. As you say, he reeled off, let's see here. He reeled off a consistent run of wins in a row, let's say, and positioned himself right in the mix. And then Lockett, he won the Moto 1. Second moto, he was leading or second. And his hand blew off the handlebars in that first section after the first corner. And that kind of ended the potential run. But based on the form at that time, if he'd sustained that, I think he probably would have gone all the way. Because he had almost, as he did in years following when Hurlings dropped out, he kind of possessed the ghost of Jeffrey, which is an odd way to put it.
No, but he was one of those ones, I think, where the favourites dropped out, and he can be considered an outside favourite. In 2015, he kind of picked up the mantle, and I don't think guys are really expected to be a championship contender.
Nor Jonas, nor Sua, nor Guillot, nor any of the names that ended up featuring.
Yeah, I mean, once Hurlings was injured, and Ferrandis also, did Ferrandis do his knee, I think? That was the first year where him and Hurlings started cutting each other up and getting into a bit of dirty business. And Jordi Tixier as well was defending champion, but I don't think people really expected him to be such a threat. I mean, he'd finished 2014 in a brilliant way, just made the most of the situation with Hurlings out and trying to play catch up with that broken femur and then the stomach infection and the bone infection as well. But it was one of those great seasons, Lewis, where nobody really sort of propped, people just appeared for like little mini stints, grabbed points and then put their name up there. But then, someone else would then inherit the spotlight.
To go back to what I said previously about MX2, it was even better than I imagined. With 4 rounds to go, the top 7 was separated by 46 points. Like, that's, again, similar to the 2015 vibe. That's unheard of. Can we have that every year, please? The top. Now, admittedly, at that point, Hurlings was out, so you could say it was 6 riders. But Anstey was 7th place. And 46 down on Jonas, who led at the time. Hurlings at that point had missed 7 consecutive motos, but was only 10 points off of the championship lead, which is so Hurlings. Insert that Hurlings stat in any season, really.
Well, Hurlings have won the championship in 2012 and in 2013, and then in 2014 there was the snap femur, which was dramatic enough as it is. But then I remember him at the age of 20 in 2015 just being this downcast, almost like slightly depressed figure, because he was being beaten by other riders, which was a bit of a strange scenario for him. I mean, he had that very scary crash in Argentina where he collided with Jonas on that big jump next to the start gate. And then he was beaten by Guillot and Matterley Basin, I think, which kind of started to rot his mind a little bit because he was trying to work out what was going on. I mean, you mentioned the injuries that flared up as well, but then by the time he was clattered by Tixier and had his right hip dislocated, I can remember just, I don't know if you do as well, but I mean, he was being treated on the track for like 30 minutes. He had 2 saline drips on him. He was eventually carted away, to a nearby hospital in Locket, in Karlovy Vary. I'm not sure exactly where the hospital was, but ironically ended up being in a bed quite close to Tixier, who was being treated for a nasty gash on his arm. And you just thought, well, where does his career go? Because at that point as well, people were starting to speculate, saying, okay, is it time for you to get on a 450? And Herlings in interviews was saying to people, it really depends on KTM. I'm contracted to Red Bull KTM for 2016, but, with Cairoli being there, and also the flux over the 350, 450, what do they do? Because Jonas was coming up, as part of the MX2 program, and Herlings was a little bit trapped in the middle. He should have moved, but then, does he really need to be in the same team as Tony Cairoli? KTM wanted to cover both bases, and in the end, it made sense that he stayed down in MX2 in 2016 to try and win that third title, and then gave Red Bull KTM, sufficient billing in both categories.
Yeah, let's defend our friend Jeffrey for a second here. A lot of shit he took for not moving up to MXGP, but it in fact, as you said, wasn't entirely his decision, which I don't think many people believed at the time, but it really wasn't.
Yeah.
And speaking of his run of injuries this year, the main one that stands out to me for some reason is a finger in Uddevalla, crashed in the first corner, and then the bone. I just remember the image of the bone. Like, I've never seen a bone so clear before. And there were a few others as well, but that I forget. Argentina, if you remember, first moto, he didn't get injured, but he collided with Jonas, I want to say?
Yeah,
on the first lap?
On the jump,
sorry.
Yeah.
Just a classic Herlings season, really. But yeah.
But the thing is, it was inevitable, Lewis, that he would be in the same team as Cairoli. But the way that the contracts worked out, it was made sense, of course, that KTM would have one big hitter on a 250 and another one kind of bedding in the new 450. So why would you put Herlings and Cairoli next to each other? I mean, especially when one of them has had a big injury and doesn't mind staying on a 250 again. It's a bit of a no-brainer. And then, of course, Jorge Prado entered the picture, like lightning. And, with Jonas, Prado, Cairoli, Herlings, and then you had like ample backup, say like Glenn Koldenhoff, who was a steady rider as well, helping to develop the 450 even further. It was a purple patch for the Austrians.
And I think it's important to mention that although Tim Geiser was the MX2 world champion this year, there was still no sign of what was coming for Tim Geiser. No one looked at Tim Geiser winning this championship and went, this is the start of something special. For him to come out the following year and go 1-1 in Qatar was just as shocking as Febvre winning this championship or Nagl winning Qatar in 2015 or any of those surprising moments. They all file under the same category. And also,
the advantage Geiser has was that he was using a 450 to train, even while he was racing in MX2 in 2015. So he had that kind of leeway, I guess you could say.
Not to make this the Crash Kings podcast, but if you want another one to YouTube, look at Paul's Jonas Mexico Crash 2015, because I don't really understand that. It defies all laws of physics and stuff like that.
Is it worse? Is it worse than his one the following year in Sweden?
Why don't I remember that?
I think it's very similar, but I'm
really struggling to recall that one.
So it had a couple of big crashes. Lockett, you don't really want to look at either. That was that 2015. It might have been as well.
It's funny. Like at this point, Jonas definitely had a massive reputation as a crasher who really needs to sort himself out, but he kind of shed that quite quickly. Maybe not quickly, but he did shed that eventually.
But not a serial crasher. To somebody that when he did it, he went big.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, this crash in Mexico. To paint a picture, we have those advertising boards over the jumps in MXGP. Jonas's body without the bike was above those. And also to use this reference point that we've done to describe crashes a few times, had Jeffrey crashed like that, he may still be recovering from those injuries now. I don't know. Just that
it was a lucky escape.
Another standout from 2015, but you mentioned Guillot beating Jeffrey. That stands out as well. Where was Ben Watson this year? The main memory of Ben is that in Valkenswaard, he crashed in the first turn and landed in the pond that was on the outside of turn one. What a weird year.
Was that the season where he destroyed his foot in Argentina?
No, that was 16.
Next year?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah, that was the bad year.
Yeah, that was the bad year. Well, all of these were kind of not great years. It wasn't until 2017 where we really found our feet.
Speaking of Mexico and Leon, another bizarre track.
I liked that place.
It was weird.
I liked it.
Very weird.
I don't know why. I liked the whole vibe. I liked the hotels.
The strange dirt.
I liked the food. I liked the pits. I liked everything.
Being surrounded by cacti and...
What's cacti? Oh, cactus. Yeah. Sorry, I'm an idiot.
But, I mean, I like the Dragonback. I mean, there were some elements of the track that were pretty good. But, yeah, I mean, there was also that famous crash. Who is it that landed on Alexander Tonkov? I think when he was riding a factory Husky. That was like a pretty graphic crash as well on the penultimate jump. But it might have been in 2017. I can't remember how many years we went into Leon. But yeah, wow. I mean, it was a good championship, good world championship. I mean, you're talking Qatar, Argentina, Thailand, Mexico, the US. Always like going to the US GP, even though it's sort of, the crowds didn't come out of Glen Helen. But it's very strange because if you look at the world championship standings for, 2015, then you have all these random American riders down the list. People like Josh Grant and Jason Anderson, they were, picking up points at Glen Helen. And then, of course, that sort of cycle continued into 2016 when we went to Charlotte and then to Glen Helen again, where Eli Tomac popped up and made his MXGP contribution. But I remember finishing 2015 with a good, even though it was incredibly sort of tiring to be trekking around a little bit more than we had been doing on an international scale, it was like a proper feeling of a world championship,
I don't know if you want to talk about this quickly, but I do feel like it factors into the 2015 craziness, and it really is the end of 2015. 2015 also gave us the incredible Ben Townley ride at the 2015 Motocross of Nations, which set us up for the unexpected and also surprising Ben Townley comeback as a factory rider in 2016 MXGP, which was also the first year that Suzuki was under Stefan Evert's leadership.
Yeah, the beginning of the end. But then also that was a move because Desalle had left Suzuki to go to Kawasaki, who of course had to reinvent themselves after the Villopoto and Rattray. Who was, I think Tixier was his teammate. Desalle, I want to say. I think he had a contract actually with Kawasaki where you would do 1 year as defending champion in MX2 and then have another year on a 450. I think that was the arrangement made in 2015. So yeah, there was some reinvention, and that spot came open for Ben Townley, which was a great story at the time, and it was very cool that somebody can come back with like a privateer, a stock Honda, and just ride as well as he did at ONA, and then that sort of second factory slot, and just as is the case with Ben, injury gets in the way.
But he did win. As you know, did he win a moto, or it was just a qualifying race in Thailand? Wasn't
qualifying race, yeah.
I don't think he ever won an actual legitimate moto. Maybe he was second in one of those in Thailand. But anyway, that's 2016. Anything else stand out? I mean, this has definitely been a little bit chaotic, but as was the nature of the 2015 season. It was just every week was a different series.
We followed the script.
Just about. I guess I should, speaking of following the script, I should tell you, got a Yamaha YZ125 or 250 collecting dust in your garage or garage? Maybe it's time to give that beast a fresh new look. Scratch that, a totally new look. Polosport just dropped the YZ125 250 restyling kit, and here's the kicker. It fits every model from 2002 all the way to 2021. Yep, you heard that right. 2 decades of YZs covered. And this isn't just a plastics kit. You're getting a full package. A brand new gas tank, a complete seat, an airbox, and of course, a full set of fresh plastics to make your ride look factory new. As for the price, well, you might want to check that out for yourself. Let's just say, for what you're getting, it's a game changer. Polosport.com for the restyling kit, and there's also a Honda restyling kit. So I'm not sure if restyling kits are all the craze at the moment or all the rage, but really deep in those. And thank you to Prox/ProX as well for their continued support of this podcast. I'm a big fan of that company, the way they do business. All they stand for, a lot of common sense over there, and it would be common sense for you to make an order for your motorcycle. They've got parts for every manufacturer, year, model, make, whatever you've got. They've got stuff for you and stuff, a reasonable price as well. So, mass props.
Lewis, if I told you in 2015 at the Motocross of Nations that you would be in the future known as Big Lou and would be, very much a personality that's at the forefront of media coverage of SMX, would you have believed me?
Honestly, I've kind of been a bit distracted through this podcast because it has been a weird.
It's 10 years.
It's put me back in those shoes. Like as you're mentioning random moments, I'm remembering where I was, and then I'm remembering maybe some of the struggles, like talking to people and stuff like that. Like this is kind of this will be on my mind for the rest of the day. Do you want to know what's been in my mind while you've been talking and while I've been distracted?
What?
I wish there was a way to know that you were in the good old days before you've actually left them.
Very philosophical.
No, genuinely, as much as
That's why you got to live for the moment.
Yeah, I know, but it's kind of a reminder for that. I do stress so much about doing a good job just doing a good job, really. But, you compare it to back then when I wasn't talking to fellow media members, let alone riders. Even talking to the great Adam Wheeler was a step too far, let alone Ryan Villopoto.
Well, when you weren't being lectured.
Yes, well, that clearly made a difference. But I was meant to say at the beginning, my first Adam Wheeler memory, because you've got to remember, in 2015, podcast, although Mathis was quite underway with Pulp, that was kind of it. So still, I knew the name Adam Wheeler as an author on articles and in magazines. So I remember the first time I walked in a press room and saw you working. And I remember someone telling me, and I don't know why someone would have told me. Maybe they would give it, it was Ray. So maybe Ray was just giving me my induction into the media centre. But he said,
Ray
Adam
Archer,
Wheeler over there. Yep, great friend of ours, great guy. All the time in the world for Ray. Brilliant photographer as well. He said, that guy over there pointing at you, he's owed X amount of money from X client. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't, okay, so that's how this sport works then. Oh, I was kind of, it was kind of like, oh, that happens kind of thing.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, very weird now to think that Ray told me that as I just walked into a media centre for the first time.
There's cautionary tales everywhere, Lewis. You just have to make your own way as best you can. But also, being able to talk about some of these memories. And it's good because you maybe think, oh, what happened to Desalle that year? And you look up a few results. But it also sort of flashes back to time when, I think he was quite a misunderstood rider, Clement Desalle, as well as sort of Christophe Pourcel. Once you sort of really spend time in the paddock as a journalist and you try to understand these people to write about them, and sometimes when you're earning money for, say, Suzuki, and you have to write about them and you need some sort of information or recourse or some source of information about what's happened to them or what's going on with them or what happens to the race, then, that it just creates this sort of relationship and these series of memories, and they kind of live on. I mean, I can remember thinking Clement was very difficult to work with and quite rude sometimes. But then I worked out that I had him completely the wrong way around. And he was actually a very well-educated. His parents did a fantastic job in giving him a set of values. And if you were polite and respectful to him and you were transparent with him, then he would give it back to you, no problem. I remember him making me wait, the better part of 20 to 25 minutes just by his camper where I had to get a quote for a Suzuki press release, just while he chatted to a mate. And I was thinking, mate, I'm here for Suzuki, right? And you're a factory Suzuki rider. Just talk to me and then you can spend the rest of the afternoon or the evening with your buddy. But, it was almost like a little bit of a test. It's like, will you wait for me? And then I'll give you what you need. And things like that kind of stick with you. And that also helps you kind of learn, how to handle different personalities. And in such a diverse section of society that is a race paddock, that can ultimately be helpful.
Yeah, it is actually funny. I've never thought about that. But the education that I got as just people skills from dealing with someone like Jeremy Sewer and Max Anstey who will just talk and talk and talk. And basically all you've got to do is say, how was your day? And you just get all this information to Desalle, where I distinctly remember I never quite cracked Desalle until the end, but also he was almost part of the era before me. So whereas I can relate to Sua and Jonas and Ben and Jeffrey on like an age level, maybe to Desalle I was just a young, stupid kid. I don't know. Towards the end, not at all, but at the beginning. He won the 2016 Assen GP going 2-2, and I interviewed him afterwards. I asked him one question, and I then went to ask the second question, and I remember him rolling his eyes so visibly, and I remember being like, shit. Like, I don't, like, because I was mid-question as well, so I was like, I don't know what to do here. That stuck with me. But then, weirdly, I remember his last GP, he came up to me, and he was like, do you have my phone number? And I was like, no. He was like, oh, why haven't you got my phone number? Here's my number. Let me know if... And I was like, okay. Haven't we come far from our rolling of the eyes? It
you
is
went from
weird.
eye rolling Desalle to being eye bored by Tomac.
But
so there you
yes, a lot of eyes. But no, but that does sum up Desalle, I think. It all was dependent on the moment you caught him in. Yeah. Because he could be the nicest guy in the world or kind of a dick. And it just depended on the day, the time, all of that. I will say this, though. I'm again, distracted thinking about your question about, like, if you'd told 2015 Lewis. I think if you'd told 2015 Lewis that he could call people like Jeffrey, Jeremy, Pauls, Ben, Max, all of these... If you told Lewis in that moment when he wasn't talking to them that, like, in 10 years' time, they will be your good friends... I would be very surprised and very unsure of how that path is going to happen. Because my reaction would have been, well, I'm not really sure I've got the confidence to even say hello to them. So I don't know how I'm going to get there. That's probably the most... Because work ethic can get you anywhere, can't it? As far as like putting words on a paper. But like to create the relationships, there's not really a proven path for that, I guess. So like that would have been more of an unobtainable goal. If you told me that in 2 years you could be writing you could have an article published on Racer X, I would have been like, okay, I guess I just need to work hard then. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the time, writing was still, pre-podcast, it was a way to express an opinion. Now we just go on, we make one of these videos, we make an audio recording, we go on TikTok or whatever your outlet is. But then at the time, you needed to be at the event. I think you still do. I think people who are at the events and have those contacts and, have those relationships to be able to get information or get an education and be able to impart that has a value that's it's very underrated, I think, in this day and age where anyone can just make a video saying, I think Jet Lawrence is the best ever and this is why, without having perhaps ever spoken to Jet Lawrence or any of his rivals or team staff or whatever. So it's it's not to be sniffed at, I think, and you do make a basis for that. And anybody who's still harboring dreams of being in sports journalism, I think now more than ever, you help your credibility by getting to an event, any event, a team launch, preseason test, managing to tap your way into some sort of team, some consciousness around a team of a source of information you want to write about, then this gives you extra validity, I think.
I do remember really struggling in 2015 with imposter syndrome in a way, because I was at the races and I was writing about the races, but when I would look around the media room and see someone like yourself or Lorenzo Resta or anyone like that, I felt like, although I was there, I was so not there comparatively that I felt like I didn't feel like my opinion or my words carried much weight sat in the same room as you or Lorenzo or whoever else. And I remember really struggling with that. Like, I almost lacked the confidence to even write, because I was like, what do I have to offer that is even comparable to anyone in this room, let alone got a USP? So, yeah, I do remember that as well. But funny how, just wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them. Let's end on this.
A poignant thought, yes.
Yeah, it's quite emotional, don't cry.
What year next?
Well,
what year next?
Okay. I don't want to talk about this because I really don't see how it's going to happen. And this is separate discussion. I've spoken this year to Jeffrey and Tommy separately, and they've both said they will together do a 2012 podcast.
Oh, wow.
The logistics of that, I don't know. But they're into it. So I don't know, but I feel like that isn't something that can be done on Zoom, is it? That has to be in person. Has to be. Like, you have to get the raw emotion of them together, where their conversation will just go, and then
Well, it would be gold on video.
Yeah.
But, it could still happen on Zoom. I think because Jeffrey is going to be back at the Grand Prix soon, and then Tommy is obviously committed to a British schedule or whatever he's doing.
Not to put the horse in front of the cart here. No, sorry, the cart in front of the horse. The other way would be quite sensible. You're going to Lommel. I would like to go to Lommel. Jeffrey lives near Lommel. Maybe if I gave Tommy $2,000, he'd come to Lommel.
$2,000?
I said, so I'm also working on another podcast with Jeffrey, which I've got some sponsors for already. You know what? Fuck it. I'll just say it. I said to Jeffrey, I want 2 podcasts with you. I want to get you and Tommy in the same room to talk about 2012, and I want to get you and Chase in the same room to talk about basically being the same person as far as employment, but in different worlds, like the differences between KTM rider in America versus Europe, and then difference in series, and just you can kind of compare notes. And I said to Jeffrey, I'll give you start money for each podcast. Because I'm a nice guy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I said to him, how much start money would you want? And then he didn't really give me a figure, so I don't know if I got away with it or not. But
I don't know. First, you have to try and tease the concept and say, do you fancy doing it? Because, if you say, I've got Chase Sexton sitting here now and you're not here, then that's also a wasted opportunity for him, money or not.
Well, I'm thinking, with those guys, it's easier to sell because if I were to do that, like the shared sponsors, Red Bull, Oakley, Alpine Stars, like for those brands, it's a no-brainer to get involved in, isn't it? Whereas Tommy and Jeffrey live on different ends of the spectrum as far as Monster, Red Bull, O'Neill, Alpine Stars, Triumph, KTM, So that's maybe a little bit difficult from a money point of view. So that's why Tommy's start money, if he's listening to this, would be less. But as far as
2012 is going to be traumatic enough as it is for him, but you're going to pay him less as well.
But you would know. Maybe I'm going to try this for Lommel because you would need to be there because I would have the fan perspective, you would have the inside perspective. So, in fact, maybe I don't need to be there. Maybe you know what? I'll arrange it for you.
Maybe we can make a plea on social media for the person who threw a ham sandwich at Jeffrey and Matterley Basin to also join the podcast. And ask, firstly, why he decided to throw away a ham sandwich and how he managed to throw it in such a fine arc to hit the Dutchman, like Tommy's home Grand Prix.
Honestly, that podcast is going to be, if it works and me and you and Jeffrey and Tommy are together in a room, that will be a 3-hour podcast minimum. It
was a good duel. But it wasn't quite as bad-blooded as people remember.
No, but like the story of like Tom. I know Tommy's told the story that he cried after Lockett. And Jeffrey was in a car crash. There's all of that to unpack aside from the racing.
And Hurling's lapping everyone up to 3rd place. At Lirop. There's quite a few going on in 2012 as well.
Cutting over out of the gate.
I also want, Zach Osborne was a character as well in that championship.
He's going to need a lot of money to fly to Lommel.
Well, you might see him every other weekend. If he's in Birmingham for the Supercross, then we should try and, get him on the record.
Yeah, but as far as this podcast and this specific format, you know what? Lommel, you agree, of all the times, Lommel would be the one where we could potentially make this happen in person. Okay, so that's my mission. And it's on record, so I have to. For this podcast, I would like to do somewhere between 05 and 07.
But we did 2008 recently, which was, maybe 2006 because it was the Everett season.
Yeah, or maybe some sort of hybrid of 2005 and 2006. Maybe we can put those together as the end of the Everett's era.
Yeah, there's also a bit of political turbulence around the sport at that point as well. So that could be quite good.
Okay, well, I don't know about that, so that would be... maybe one point we'll do... Well, we're never going to be able... Unfortunately for you, we're never going to be able to do one of these podcasts where you're not the main character. Because even 2015, I was there, but not...
but like if we do something mad like 2020 or, one of the seasons where, you were far more implicated than I was, then... Or is that too recent? I don't know.
Maybe it's too recent.
And how long do How long do we wait before we look back at 2021?
It's crossed my mind. But we're done. Honestly, this has gone on for far too long. I don't really know how we've done it because, to be honest with you, I feel like we only scratched the surface. But that is the issue with doing these yearly reviews. But hopefully you all enjoyed it just as much as the 2008 one. If you didn't, let us know why and what was different to the 2008 one. If you enjoyed it more, tell us why also. We will be back next week. Yes, next week, because we will be jumping in our time machine and returning to the current day with the MXGP of Castilla-La Mancha, where we will once again see if Tim Geiser is going to grab this series by the horns or not. That's the story, I do believe. But until then, and then also the following week, we will not only be reviewing St. Jean d'Angely, we will also be co-hosting Pulp MX together. So quite simply, I will struggle to keep Adam Wheeler invested in this format after 2 weeks' time. We may go on a winter break.
Try.
Anyway,
we'll
thank
try
you.
when we can.
Thank you everyone for listening. Thank you everyone for watching. We will see you in 7 days' time to talk about the MXGP of Castilla-La Mancha. Thanks again. And yeah, let us know what year you want to hear from or hear about next. Thanks for listening.